Hey guys, happy Tuesday. Hope you're doing well. Hope you enjoyed the weather yesterday. It was so nice to be outside for part of the day working in the yard, and my family did a little fire pit dinner last night, cooking hot dogs and s'mores over the fire. So I hope you had a good time in the weather. It really is good for you to get out into the sun. Vitamin D and fresh air and a little bit of exercise goes a long way with mental and physical health. Um, even little even little changes in your activity levels can actually be really helpful. So I encourage you as much as you can, get yourself outside here and there throughout the day. Don't just sit at that computer and work yourself all day long, but um, yeah, get some sunshine if there is any. Today looks a little bit more dreary. We're going to be talking about the French Revolution. That's actually one of the more interesting topics, I think, that we cover. It's a really fascinating storyline, and it lasts actually about 60 years. People call it the French Revolution. I think it's probably more accurate to call it the French Revolutions. There really is multiple layers to this thing, and it keeps going. They write like four different constitutions, and they, ebb and flow in their views of the monarchy. And then here comes Napoleon, and then after Napoleon is gone, they actually kind of half-heartedly reinstitute the monarchy. It's a really fascinating story, and maybe part of my love for it is I really love the book Les Mis, the novel by Victor Hugo that was turned into the musical and several different iterations of film. And Les Mis, I think rightly, is understood as a part of the French Revolution story. It's much later on; it's like the 1840s, but just fascinating stuff to me. I think it's fascinating. Um, and maybe you will too. I just want to give you a little bit of background on it today. We'll talk about the actual events of the revolution starting tomorrow, but today just want to give you an understanding of like what are they frustrated about. You probably have a pretty good understanding of American history, like what are Americans upset about. Maybe that needs to grow and be nuanced as you grow as a student, but yeah, the French Revolution might just be a little bit more foreign to you, which makes perfect sense. So I just want to give you some background to it, okay? So let's jump in. One of the things that's true about France, which is different than actually a lot of the other places, is that for the French, they had not changed nearly as much from like the 1500s on. Um, in terms of their social structure and the way they had society set up, there is a lot more change happening in England and other places than there was in France. Now, to be sure, all of these places are going to change much more steadily and quickly once you get to like World War One. World War One is really a watershed moment for Europe. Everything changes after that, and the Industrial Revolution speeds that along before World War One. But France was sort of dragging its feet, I think, in some ways, in some important ways. It had really had a lot of feudalism still left. Now, maybe feudalism is a little bit of a unknown term to you, but feudalism means like, okay, you got a king at the top, and the king gathers loyalty to himself by granting land and titles and status to a group of nobles, and the nobles make money off of people renting their land or using their mills, and you have this sort of tiered sense in society where all the wealth is tied to the land ownership, and the land starts with the king, goes to the nobles, then there's like lesser nobles, and all the way down to the peasants and serfs. And unfortunately, France was still kind of like that. Their privilege, the privileged upper class, was still in place, and this was really unfortunate because it meant there was lots of social injustice, and there was heavy taxes, and there's real poverty problems, and all those things are going to feed into the revolution. The biggest differences between the French Revolution and the American Revolution will be this poverty moment. Certainly, there were poor people in the American colonies, but actually, the American colonies were pretty well off. Their standard of living was quite high comparatively. And maybe we would say even the social injustice factor is more acute in the French Revolution than it is in the American Revolution. But here's how the French society was organized. it organized into three estates, um, three tiers. The first estate was the clergy. Now the clergy was about 130,000 people, um, which sounds maybe substantial, but there was about 27 million French people at the time, so it's a small minority, right? One of the things that's important to note about the clergy, though, is that even within the clergy, there's a divide. The bishops and the cardinals at the upper level of the clergy, those people came from noble families, and their interests were really controlled by the noble interests. So when the clergy weighed in on things, they really favored the nobles. Now, the more local parish priests often were quite poor themselves and were, I think, more interested in taking care of the poor and the people around them. Then you have this noble class. About 350,000 people belonged to that estate, the second estate, and they owned 30% of the land. Actually, when it comes down to it, the church actually owned a lot of land, and so did the nobles. And then the rest of the land kind of goes amongst everyone else. But um, they had leading government positions and military positions, and they had this huge advantage. The clergy and the nobles did not have to pay this main tax, this tile tax. It was a huge advantage. It's the main way that the French people were taxed, and the nobles and the clergy didn't have to pay it. These are the people who have actually most of the resources, and they don't have to pay the taxes. And lastly, you have the third estate, everyone else. Now, everyone else doesn't mean everyone else was a peasant. It's actually a pretty expansive sort of subset of society there. You have these wealthy merchants at the top. You have people you could consider sort of middle class. The word for middle class in the French context is bourgeoisie, which is a word that we use to mean like privileged, actually. Partly because that's the way Karl Marx talked about it. So you ever heard somebody call something bougie before? Like, oh, that's a bougie purse. Like, that's rich. That's like upper class stuff, right? Um, so that's where that comes from. But the bourgeoisie is a part of the third estate, just like the peasants are a part of the third estate. And so you have a really sort of stratified third estate. But here's the real kicker: when the three estates get together to vote on things, what's called the Estates Generale, is each estate got one vote. So here you have 130,000 people having one vote, 350,000 people having one vote, and then 26.5 million people having one vote. 3 votes total, and it's obviously not equally distributed. It's one of the real issues of social injustice. Whenever they wanted to make any kinds of changes, it always favored the rich because they had an unequal amount of power in the voting process. The second level to this that we need to understand, besides the way the society was set up, which was unfair, is that there was this real financial crisis preceding the revolution. Wars were a big issue. They had just come out of the American Revolutionary War, but they had been fighting wars really for 2 straight centuries. What's called the Second Hundred Years' War was really, really expensive for the French. Beyond that, they had these terrible harvests in 1787 and 1788, and they had an economic slowdown in terms of production and manufacturing. This led to food shortages and unemployment, which of course didn't really touch the nobles and didn't touch the clergy very much, maybe not even the bourgeoisie, but it did impact the peasants immediately. That's one of the hardest things for me to swallow historically, is this idea that the people who are hurt most in any kind of strain or tragedy is always the most vulnerable people. And so that's what we see in the French Revolution, the peasants really, really struggling to find a way to pay for food for their family and so forth. Now, this was made worse by the fact that the king and the government still carried on as though nothing was wrong, spending huge amounts of money on war and on luxury. Marie Antoinette was very, very famous for her own extravagance. Her husband sort of allowed her, huge amounts of money in the budget to spend just kind of wildly. Um, when they built Versailles, it was already lavish, and then when she became queen, she built all kinds of like entertaining things for herself. Like she built a little French village so she could pretend to farm sometimes, and she liked to do that. And she bought really expensive jewelry and threw these lavish parties that lasted weeks and weeks and weeks. And the people saw this. They knew that money was being spent wildly while they starved. And the last sort of, the last straw is that King Louis, the same dynasty we've been talking about a little bit, King Louis is going to call for a meeting of the Estates General in order to propose a new tax. So on top of the inequality, on top of the poverty, he says, okay, what we need is a new tax. Instead of relieving the people's suffering, he wants to add to it. And the people are not going to take it very lightly. And this is going to lead us into the revolution, which really kind of gets going in earnest in 1789. The people are fed up, and they're going to take matters into their own hands. And what's really going to happen is they're going to take the ideas of the Enlightenment and they're going to bring it to the streets. The peasants are going to say, as far as they understand the Enlightenment principles, they're going to say, we're going to make sure to enact them. They're going to start to believe we can do better than the government we've got right now. We can do better than the way the society is set up right now. Let's fix this. And it's going to be tumultuous, and sometimes it's going to be very, very violent. And it's going to bring art and music and literature, and it's going to be, I think, a pretty intense storyline. So we'll jump into the actual events of the French Revolution starting tomorrow.